Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The air in the city carried a crisp February chill, the kind that made people huddle closer together, hands buried deep in their pockets or wrapped around steaming cups of coffee. Red and pink decorations had begun to bloom in shop windows, filling the streets with a quiet anticipation for Valentine's Day. Luca never paid much attention to the holiday. It was just another day on the calendar, another excuse for overpriced chocolates and unrealistic expectations. He had learned long ago that love was a fleeting thing, something that slipped through your fingers when you held on too tightly. But this year, something was different. It started with a letter. He had been sitting in his usual spot at Café Belladonna, a small corner table near the window where he could watch the world pass by. He liked the way the steam from his cappuccino curled into the cold air, how the scent of roasted coffee beans mingled with the faint sweetness of vanilla from the pastries behind the counter. It was peaceful. Then the waitress, a young woman named Julia, placed a folded envelope beside his cup. "This was left here for you," she said with a knowing smile. Luca frowned. "By who?" Julia only shrugged. "I don't know. It was on your table when I came to clean up." Curious, he picked up the letter. It was a simple white envelope, unmarked except for his name scrawled in elegant cursive on the front. Luca hesitated before opening it. To the man who sits by the window, always lost in thought. "I see you every morning, sipping your coffee, staring out at the world as if waiting for something, or someone. You don't know me, but I've been watching you for a while now, not in a strange way, I promise. Just enough to wonder who you are, what stories you carry in your eyes. Valentine's Day is coming. Maybe this year you won't have to spend it alone. No name, no signature, just a letter, left like a whisper in the wind." Luca's fingers tightened around the paper. His first instinct was suspicion. Was this a prank? A joke? Or was it something else? Something real? He glanced around the cafe, searching for a pair of eyes that might be watching him. But everyone seemed engrossed in their own worlds, laughing, chatting, lost in books or scrolling through their phones. Who had written this, and why? For the first time in a long time, Luca felt a spark of something unfamiliar: hope. Luca read the letter again, as if the words might reveal something more the second time around. The delicate strokes of the handwriting, the mysterious way it had been left for him. It all felt like a scene from an old romance novel, the kind he used to roll his eyes at. Yet here he was, holding a letter that had been meant for him, addressed to the man who sits by the window. He exhaled, setting it down beside his coffee cup. His first instinct was to ignore it, to brush it off, as a harmless game, a coincidence. And yet, his mind kept turning over the possibilities. Had someone been watching him? How long? And why had they chosen now to leave this message? He turned his gaze to the cafe's patrons, searching for an unfamiliar face, someone who might be sneaking a glance in his direction. But nothing seemed out of place. There was an elderly man reading a newspaper, a young couple sharing a slice of cheesecake, a woman in the corner typing furiously on her laptop. No one looked guilty. No one looked like they had been waiting for him to react. Julia returned to his table, her brown eyes twinkling with curiosity. "So, who's your secret admirer?" Luca smirked. "I was hoping you could tell me." She laughed, shaking her head. "I have no idea. But whoever it is, they must be brave. Not every day someone confesses their admiration like that. Confesses. The word sat strangely in his chest. Was it really a confession or just a game? You could write back, she suggested, refilling his water glass. Leave a letter at the table tomorrow. Maybe they'll answer. Luca stared at the paper once more. The idea was ridiculous. Childish, even. He wasn't the kind of man who played romantic scavenger hunts, and yet that flicker of curiosity refused to die down. The next morning he arrived at Café Belladonna a little earlier than usual. The usual scent of coffee and fresh pastries filled the air as he took his seat by the window. He hesitated only briefly before placing an envelope beside his cappuccino, addressed simply, "To the one who sees me." Inside, his message was short. "I don't know who you are, but I suppose I'm curious. Why now? Why me? I'll be here tomorrow, same time, same place." He felt ridiculous as he left the cafe that morning, but a strange excitement had settled. In his chest, would they answer? Or had he just sent his words into the void? Either way, he would find out tomorrow. The next morning, Luca arrived at Café Belladonna with a quiet anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was nothing, just a meaningless game, but as he stepped inside, his heartbeat quickened. Would the letter still be there? Had they replied? Or had he imagined something that was never meant to continue? He approached his usual table and felt a rush of surprise. There, beside his cappuccino, was another envelope. It was smaller this time, but the handwriting was the same, elegant, precise, and unmistakably familiar. He sat down quickly, his fingers lingering over the seal before finally opening it. "Luca," you replied. "I wasn't sure if you would. Maybe you think this is silly. Maybe you think it's a joke. But it's not. Why now? Because sometimes life waits until we're ready to notice what's been in front of us all along. Why you? Because I see you, Luca, and something tells me you need to be seen. I wonder if you'll write back again." There was no name, no signature, just that same quiet, unshakable mystery. Luca's fingers tightened around the letter. Whoever they were, they knew his name. But how? He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He had always considered himself an observer, the one who watched others while remaining unseen. And yet, someone had been watching him, not in a way that unsettled him, but in a way that felt intimate. He glanced around the cafe, scanning faces for any sign of recognition, but no one seemed to be watching him. Julia passed by, raising an eyebrow at his expression. "Another one?" he nodded. "And?" she pressed, curiosity dancing in her voice. Luca hesitated before answering. "They know my name." Julia's brows lifted. "Ooh, that means they're closer than you think." That thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For the first time, he wondered if he had already spoken to this person before, maybe even unknowingly sat beside them. Was it someone he saw every day, someone he had overlooked? The idea of writing back felt inevitable now, so he reached into his bag, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write. "You say you see me, but I don't see you. Give me a sign. A clue. Something. Or will this remain just words on paper? Luca." He folded the letter, tucked it inside a fresh envelope, and left it on the table. As he walked out of the cafe, a strange feeling settled in his chest, something between excitement and fear. Would they answer again? And if they did, Would he finally start to see them too? Luca returned to Café Belladonna the next morning, his heart pounding in quiet anticipation. He told himself he wasn't nervous. It was just a game, a silly exchange of letters with a stranger. And yet his fingers itched to reach for the envelope the moment he spotted it on his table. Another letter. He sat down, exhaling slowly before unfolding the note. Luca, you ask for a sign, a clue. But isn't it more exciting not to know? Still, I'll be kind. You see me every day. But you do not notice me. I wonder, if I stood before you, would you recognize me, or have I only ever been ink on paper to you? Luca's grip on the letter tightened. His breath caught in his throat as he reread the words. You see me every day. His mind raced. It had to be someone from the cafe, maybe a customer who came in around the same time, maybe someone who worked here. Julia? No, impossible. She was too direct, too playful. If she had been the one writing the letters, she would have confessed by now, grinning at him as she did. The other staff? He barely knew their names. His gaze flickered to the other patrons. The elderly man reading the newspaper, the couple in the corner, the woman with the laptop. You see me every day. It was frustrating, like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Just then Julia appeared at his side, glancing at the letter with a smirk. Still playing detective, I see. Luca folded the letter quickly. You know something, don't you? She laughed. I know you're intrigued. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Whoever this is, they're messing with me. Or they're challenging you, she countered. Maybe they want you to really look this time. Luca leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Look, but where? At whom? He pulled out his notebook and began writing his response. If I see you every day, then give me something real, a detail, a moment, a thread I can follow. Or are you afraid I'll see you for who you really are? He folded the letter, left it under his empty coffee cup, and walked out, feeling more restless than ever. Tomorrow, he would have his answer, or at least another piece of the puzzle. Morning came with a biting chill, but Luca barely felt it. His thoughts were too tangled in the mystery unfolding at Café Belladonna. As he stepped inside, his heart gave a subtle lurch. His table was empty, no envelope in sight. Disappointment flickered through him, but before he could sit down, Julia appeared with a knowing smirk. Looking for this? She asked, holding up a small folded note. Luca's breath caught. Where did you find it? It was left under your cup before we even opened, she said, handing it over. This person is serious. Luca unfolded the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. Luca, a thread, a moment, a piece of me. Today, at exactly 4:15 p.m., I will be here. Will you look for me? Will you finally see me? Or will I remain just ink on paper? His pulse quickened. This was it. A chance to finally put a face to the letters. He glanced at the clock, just past 10 a.m., 6 hours. The day stretched endlessly. He tried to work, tried to distract himself, but his thoughts kept circling back to the cafe. Who would be there at 4:15? How many people did he usually overlook? By the time the hour approached, Luca found himself back at Café Belladonna, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets, his nerves thrumming with anticipation. He stepped inside and scanned the room, a few familiar faces. The elderly man with his newspaper, the couple whispering over coffee, and then a woman. She sat alone near the back of the cafe, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her cup. Her hair was tucked behind her ear, revealing a delicate silver earring shaped like a feather. She looked calm, composed, but then, as if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met. Luca's breath hitched. Was it her? The answer came in the form of the smallest knowing smile, a silent challenge, a confirmation. She had been there all along. Luca stood frozen for a moment, the air between them thick with something unspoken. The woman at the back of the café. She had been the one, hadn't she? The person behind the letters. The one who had watched him without him knowing. Her smile was subtle, almost shy, but it carried an undeniable warmth, as though she had been waiting for him to notice, waiting for this exact moment. He swallowed, gathering his thoughts. His feet moved before his mind could fully catch up, pulling him toward her table. As he approached, the woman's smile deepened, and she gestured to the chair across from her. "Join me," she said softly, her voice like a melody Luca had never heard before. He nodded almost mechanically and sat down. For a moment, they both said nothing, the space between them humming with a quiet, gentle tension. The café seemed to fade away, the noise of clinking cups and distant conversations dimming as their eyes locked. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally, her fingers playing with the edge of her napkin. Luca's throat felt dry. "I didn't know what to expect." His voice sounded distant, almost unsure. You've been writing to me." "Yes," she replied, her eyes shining with an almost playful glint. "I've been writing to you, but I've also been watching you, and I wondered, if I gave you the chance, would you finally see—" "Me?" He stared at her, confusion swirling in his chest. "You've been watching me?" She nodded. "You sit by the window every morning, Luca, always with your coffee, always so absorbed in your thoughts. You were never just a man in a cafe. To me, I've seen something in you, even if you've never noticed me." Her words settled around him, heavy and delicate at once. He had been oblivious all this time, wrapped up in his own world, never once looking up to see the person who had been there all along. "I thought I knew everyone who came here," he said quietly, his eyes scanning her face for any trace of hesitation. "But I never noticed you." The woman smiled softly. "Most people don't notice the things right in front of them. It's easy to overlook, to be so absorbed in your own life that you forget there's a whole world around you, a whole world waiting to be seen." Luca's heart pounded in his chest. "But you knew me, you saw me." She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with something deeper. "I saw you, but only because I was looking." He felt the weight of her words settle within him, stirring something. Deep inside, he had spent so much time lost in his own world, never truly noticing the people or the moments that surrounded him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her smile widened. "My name is Isabella." Isabella. The name felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. As the minutes stretched, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something else, something he hadn't known he had been missing. He had found her. Or perhaps more accurately, she had found him. And now that he had truly seen her, the world around him suddenly felt more vivid, more alive. But the question lingered in his mind, what now? Isabella seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't worry," she said with a small laugh. "We don't have to figure everything out right now. But I wanted you to see me, Luca. I wanted you to know that there's more to life than what we're used to." He nodded slowly, a strange sense of peace settling over him. "I think I understand." Isabella's smile softened, and for the first time in a long while, Luca allowed himself to simply be. Days passed, each one carrying a sense of quiet anticipation. Luca no longer felt the weight of his solitude, nor the empty routine he had once embraced. He found himself looking forward to each morning, to the familiar sound of footsteps entering Café Belladonna, to the chance that he might catch a glimpse of Isabella. It was strange, this new rhythm to his life, as though something had shifted in the very air around him. Everything felt more vibrant, like the world was brimming with small, unnoticed details waiting to be discovered. He found himself noticing the way the sunlight filtered through the cafe windows, the soft laughter of a child at the table beside him, the delicate scent of cinnamon wafting through the air. But more than anything, he noticed Isabella. She hadn't been there every day since their first meeting, but each time she did appear, it was as if the world slowed down. She would slip into the cafe with the same quiet grace, her eyes scanning the room before they locked with his. No words were needed. Their eyes spoke a language that neither could fully understand, but both could feel. Luca had tried in his own way to catch up with her, to learn her story, to ask questions about her life, her world. But Isabella was different from anyone he had ever met. She wasn't one to rush through stories, to offer up her secrets in haste. Instead, she would share a piece of herself each time they spoke, her words wrapped in layers of mystery, as though inviting him to take his time and truly listen. One afternoon, they sat together again by the window. Luca had just finished his coffee, his gaze wandering out to the street as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden light across the cobblestones. He turned to Isabella, her profile soft in the fading light, and asked the question that had been tugging at his thoughts for days. Why me? Isabella looked at him, her lips curling into a gentle smile. Why not you? He frowned, not quite understanding. You've been watching me. I've been sitting here, doing the same thing every day, and you noticed me, but why? Her gaze softened and she reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. Sometimes we see people not for what they are, but for what they could be. I saw something in you, Luca, something that called out to me, even if you didn't. See it yourself, his heart skipped a beat. And what is that? Isabella's eyes met his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The same thing you see in me. The words hung between them like a secret they both shared but hadn't yet fully unraveled. Luca wasn't sure what she meant, but in that moment, he realized he didn't need to understand it all. Not yet. There was time for that later. What mattered was that they had found each other against the odds, against all the things they had once believed about themselves. I'm glad you noticed me, Luca said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. Isabella's smile deepened. And I'm glad you finally looked up. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was something more. A connection that neither had expected, but both had needed. And in that moment, with the last rays of sunlight slipping through the cafe window, Luca realized that Valentine's Day had come and gone, but he had never needed it more than he did now. For in Isabella, he had found something far more precious than any holiday could offer, the discovery of another soul who saw him, who understood him, in a way that words alone could never express. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments and whispered conversations. Each time Luca saw Isabella, a new layer of her seemed to unfold, like the delicate petals of a flower he'd never thought to examine. She wasn't like anyone he had known. There was an air of mystery about her, yes, but there was also a profound depth in the way she viewed the world. One afternoon, as the early spring air began to warm the streets, Isabella invited Luca to walk with her through the park. They strolled in silence, the sounds of the city muffled by the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. As they walked side by side, Luca glanced over at her. Her eyes were fixed on the path ahead, her expression distant, almost as if lost in thought. For the first time, he wondered if there was more to her silence than he had realized. "Isabella," he began, his voice tentative, "you never really told me much about your past." She glanced at him, her lips curling slightly at the corners. "And you never asked." Luca paused, unsure whether to push further, but her smile encouraged him. "Okay then, what's your story? Where do you come from?" Isabella sighed softly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "My story is not as simple as you might think." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes serious now. "We all have our secrets, Luca, things we keep hidden even from those we let get closest to us." Luca nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. He had never been one to pry into other people's lives, but something in her voice stirred a curiosity he couldn't ignore. "I don't need to know everything," he said gently, "but I want to understand you, the parts of you that you're willing to share." Her eyes softened, and after a moment of silence, she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "I was always the quiet one, the observer, but the world around me was always too loud. I was always looking for something more. That's why I'm here now, in this cafe, writing letters. I needed to make sense of it all." She smiled faintly, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "And then I saw you," Luca swallowed, his heart skipping a beat. He had no words to respond. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that he understood the need to search for meaning, for connection. But the weight of her vulnerability left him momentarily speechless. Isabella continued, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "Sometimes it feels like we spend our whole lives waiting for a moment when everything falls into place. But what if that moment never comes? What if all we have are these fleeting connections, these moments that only make sense when we look back on them?" Luca thought about that. He thought about their letters, the quiet exchange that had been happening between them, built on words and silence alike. He wondered if he had been waiting for something too, something that would make everything fall into place. And now, perhaps, he was finding it. "Maybe the moments don't have to make sense right away," Luca said softly. "Maybe they just need to be enough for now." Isabella's eyes met his again, and this time the sadness had softened, replaced by a quiet understanding. She nodded slowly, the barest of smiles playing at the corners of her lips. "Maybe you're right." They stood there for a long moment, the world moving around them while they were suspended in the quiet between them. And though they didn't say it aloud, they both understood. There was something unfolding between them. A story that hadn't yet been written, but was already in the making. As spring began to stretch across the city, painting the streets in shades of green and gold, Luca and Isabella's connection deepened. Their days were filled with long talks, quiet moments, and more unspoken understanding than either of them could have imagined. Yet the silence between them was never heavy. It was comfortable, like an unspoken promise that they were both learning to fulfill in their own time. But despite the sense of closeness, Luca could sense that there were still parts of Isabella that she wasn't ready to share. A layer she had kept hidden, a thread she hadn't yet unraveled. He could see it in the way she sometimes pulled back when he got too close, the way her eyes would flicker with something unreadable when he asked certain questions. It was as if she was waiting for something, waiting for him, waiting for herself, or perhaps waiting for the right moment to reveal the last part of the story she hadn't told. One evening, as they sat together in the café, their usual spot by the window now feeling like a sanctuary, Luca noticed a change. In the air, Isabella was unusually quiet, her fingers tracing patterns on her coffee cup, her gaze fixed on the street outside. "Isabella," Luca said softly, "what are you thinking?" She looked at him, the flicker of something dark in her eyes. "I've been thinking about us." Luca's heart skipped a beat. "What about us?" She hesitated, then let out a small sigh. "I've always been afraid of letting people in. I hide behind words and silence because it's easier. But you—" She trailed off, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "You've made me want to let go of those walls." His chest tightened. "Is that a good thing?" For a moment she didn't answer. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his gently, a quiet reassurance. "I don't know. I just know that I'm scared that I'll get too close, or that you'll leave once you know the full story, once you see all the parts of me I keep hidden." Luca took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he leaned in slightly. "I don't want to leave, Isabella, not now, not ever." She smiled, a bittersweet expression that held 1,000 unsaid words. "But what if I'm not the person you think I am? What if I'm not the person you want me to be?" Luca's hand tightened around hers. "I don't want you to be anyone else. I just want you to be you, all of you." Isabella looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. A truth, a promise, perhaps. And slowly she nodded, as if a decision had been made. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll tell you everything." Luca's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and yet part of him wasn't sure he was ready for what was to come. Isabella stood up, her fingers slipping from his. "Come with me," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the emotions she had yet to release. Luca followed her out of the cafe, his heart racing. They walked in silence through the streets until they reached a small, quiet park on the edge of town. It was a place they had never been together, a place that seemed untouched by the world they knew. Isabella stopped under a tree, its branches heavy with blossoms, and turned to face him. There was a vulnerability in her eyes now, a rawness that had always been hidden behind her enigmatic smile. "I've never told anyone this before," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I need you to know." Luca stood still, his hands at his sides, waiting. Isabella took a deep breath and began. "My family—" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My family was never what I wanted it to be. I spent years trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine, trying to be what they wanted me to be, not who I am. My father was distant, my mother cold, and I was always the one trying to fill the gaps they left behind." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a pain he hadn't expected. "But that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is that even when I finally understood who I was, I didn't know how to be that person, so I built walls. And when I found a way to hide behind my words, I did. Luca listened, his heart breaking for her. But I'm tired of hiding, Isabella continued, her voice stronger now. I'm tired of being afraid of what will happen if I let someone see the real me. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I'm here now, and I'm trying, Luca. I'm trying to let you in. Tears stung the back of his eyes, but he didn't look away. He took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. I'm here too, he whispered, and I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in their time together, Isabella smiled. This time, it was filled with a quiet relief. The weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift, and for the first time, Luca saw her fully, all of her. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm glow, he knew that this was just the beginning. The days following Isabella's revelation felt different, lighter. It was as though a new chapter had begun, not just for her, but for both of them. They had walked through the dark corners of their hearts, revealing fears and secrets that had once been hidden away. Now the walls between them had dissolved, leaving room for something raw and real. Luca found himself waking up each morning with a sense of purpose, a sense that there was more to life than the endless cycle of routine he had once embraced. His thoughts were no longer confined to the cafe window or the quiet monotony of his life. Instead, his mind wandered to Isabella, the way she smiled, the way she shared her fears, the way she made him see the world differently. And Isabella, for her part, seemed lighter too. She no longer carried the same weight of silence, and when she walked into the cafe, it was with a newfound ease, a joy in her step that hadn't been there before. One evening, as they sat together in their familiar spot by the window, Isabella turned to Luca, her eyes soft but full of something deeper. I've been thinking, she began, her voice more serious than usual. Luca looked up from his coffee, curiosity dancing in his gaze. About what? About us. She paused, collecting her thoughts. About everything we've shared, how much we've opened up to each other. I think this could be the beginning of something beautiful. Luca smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. I think it already is. Isabella reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his once more. Do you believe in love at first sight, Luca? She asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. He looked at her, feeling the weight of her question, feeling the pull of her gaze. He had never truly believed in such things before, but with Isabella, everything seemed different. I don't know, he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. But I believe in what I feel with you, and I know that's enough for me. Isabella smiled, her eyes shining. I think that's all we need to know. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the cafe lights, it became clear to both of them. They didn't need to rush to define their connection. It was something that simply was, something that had grown from a quiet spark into a flame, one that would continue to burn brightly if they both nurtured it. Over time, their relationship blossomed into something neither of them had expected, but both had longed for in their own ways. There were still quiet mornings spent together in the cafe, the soft click of cups and the murmur of conversation blending into the background of their world. There were still moments of vulnerability, of learning to trust and to be seen. But with every passing day, they grew closer, understanding that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfection. It was about the quiet, everyday moments that built the foundation of something lasting. As weeks turned into months, Luca and Isabella continued to build their lives together. They walked through the city hand in hand, their hearts beating into sync as they discovered new parts of themselves, new dreams to chase. And though the future remained uncertain, they knew that as long as they were together, they would face whatever came next with the same quiet strength they had found in each other. Valentine's Day had come and gone, but the love they shared was not confined to a single day. It was woven into the fabric of their lives, a love built not on fleeting moments, but on the steady, patient rhythm of two souls finding their way back to each other. And as Luca looked at Isabella, her smile reflecting the light of the world around them, he knew that this was just the beginning of their story. A story that would continue to unfold one day at a time for as long as they were willing to walk it together. For love, as they had come to understand, wasn't about finding the perfect person. It was about finding the one who made you believe in the magic of possibility, who helped you see that the ordinary could be extraordinary if you simply opened your heart to it. And Luca had found that in Isabella.